And we're back from the Starscape, and joining us now is George R.R. Martin. He's out now with his new book in the Song of Ice and Fire trilogy, A Storm of Swords. George, glad you could join us.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. As always, back once again.
Back once again. Hour 25 has changed somewhat while you've been gone, but
yes,
the medium has changed, but the message hasn't.
Well, before it was the host would change and the
and the medium wouldn't.
The medium wouldn't, yes. So now the host is staying the same and the medium is changing.
The more things change. On your book, A Storm of Swords.
A Storm of Swords.
Or A Sword of Storms, one or the other. Either one. You should write one.
A Storm of Swords. Don't confuse them. They'll go to the bookstore and ask for the wrong book. Can't have that. A Storm of Swords.
A Storm of Swords. Okay, this is the third book in a trilogy. Now,
this
how
is
many
the
more?
Third book in six.
Well, that's why I was going to ask. It started out as a trilogy.
It started out as a trilogy, yeah, but it grew. Even before I finished the first book, A Game of Thrones, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to fit it into three. So at that point I started... there was a brief period where I was in denial and I was saying 4, but that was just denial. And 6, I should be able to do it in 6. I'm aiming for 6. I think I'll be able to do it in 6. I'm writing 4 right now.
And when does book 7 come out?
Very nasty.
Oh, no, it is funny.
Yeah, they grow. They grow.
You're not writing a trilogy of skinny books.
No, they're huge books.
Your first book actually split to become the first 2, and then that happened on the second. Now that you've gotten book 3, you've conceded that it's 6 books. Book 3 is out. Book 4 is basically done.
No, not hardly done at all.
Okay.
Still in the very early stages of book 4.
Okay. Now, how are you reining in books 3 and 4 and 5? How do you rein them in?
I'm not reining them in, really. I wouldn't want to rein them in. That has too many negative connotations.
Well, then how do you...
I'm just projecting that I think I can tell the story I need to tell in 6 volumes. I mean, the fans and my readers have been very happy with what I've been doing so far, with the pacing of the books and the amount of detail and character development and the complexity of the plot. And certainly I'm not going to try to compromise on any of that in order to get the books out faster or to make them shorter. So I think the rest of the series will continue to be more or less in the same vein as the beginning of the series, and hopefully the quality will remain as high as well.
But it's just that now that you've conceded that it's going to be 6 books, you now can control it.
Yes, I hope so anyway. We'll find out. I'm sure you'll be interviewing me perhaps
probably, well, if
a few years down the road. And
well, if we do this every 12 or 18 months or something, that'll be just dandy with me. Now, the books, are they coming out in about 1-year centers, or is it about 18 months?
Well, it's taking me 18 months to 2 years to write each one. Some of them come out quicker than others because you're also partially dependent on the publisher's publication schedule. When you deliver the book, they look at it and see when the next open slot in their schedule is, and is that a good time to publish, is that not a good time to publish. A number of the fans keep asking me, in the case of A Storm of Swords, why the British edition came out in August and the American edition is only coming out now. And the answer for that does not involve any decision of mine. It's simply a matter of the Brits had a publication date open earlier, and they put a lot of effort into getting the book out as quick as possible. So there's no great secret there. It's just a matter of the internal workings of publishing.
Well, then with the globalization of publishing, does it matter if the book comes out in the UK first or America first? Because in either case, you can go up on the net, to pickyourbookstore.com on the net.
Well, that is changing the face of publishing, and I don't know what the end result will be.
How's it affecting you?
It's certainly true that this American edition probably lost thousands of sales to the British edition simply by American readers ordering it from Amazon UK. Of course, those sales mean more to the British publisher than they do to the American publisher. Britain is a smaller market. They need the open market more, and if they can get sales in America as well, that's good. The American edition will still vastly outsell the British edition in the simple number of copies, so perhaps it's not necessarily a bad thing, but, it's too early to tell, as with much of this stuff about the Internet. It's a brave new world we entered, and God help us all.
It is interesting. As an author, does it matter to you which publisher gets the sales?
No, not really. They're both my publishers. They've both done very well for me. I get royalties on either edition, so it all works out the same in the end. It drives some collectors crazy because in the particular case of my series, A Game of Thrones, the American edition was the first. Mm-hmm. By several months, because they rushed it to get it out in time to have complimentary copies of the ABA several months in advance of the official publication date. And in the case of A Clash of Kings, the second book, and A Storm of Swords, the third book, the British edition was first. So the collectors who like to have only first edition, first printings of a book have a mismatched set, and that just drives some of them nuts. But there's no help for it, and I don't know who will be first with the fourth book. We'll see.
The Lithuanian edition.
Yes, well, the foreign publishers would be in the sweepstakes too, except they're delayed by the fact of having to get the book translated. So I think the American edition or the British edition always have a slight edge there. I just came back from Germany where I met my German translator. He's just starting on the third book now, just starting to render it into German, and that's a long process. There's a lot of words.
Why is it that epic fantasy novels always seem to be big books?
Well, I think Tolkien set that bar. Lord of the Rings, if you actually look at it today, doesn't look nearly as big as my series or some of the others that came along.
It looked a lot bigger in 1965.
It certainly did, yeah. That was a time when particularly genre books, science fiction and fantasy books, were expected to come in at 60,000 words. And not 60,500 words either. They had to come pretty damn close. Roger Zelazny used to tell me some stories of some of his earlier books, the things his editors would put him through to come in exactly at that. And Lord of the Rings, of course, was much longer than that. It was at least 100,000, 120,000 word book. I'm not sure the exact length, but it was a gigantic book by the standards of its day.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's why it's a trilogy. The trilogy became for many years the accepted form for epic fantasy in imitation of Lord of the Rings. And the irony of that is Lord of the Rings was never a trilogy. It was one book that Tolkien wrote called Lord of the Rings, and he subdivided it into books, 6 books. Each of the volumes of the trilogy contains 2 books, if you actually look at the way he constructed it. So you can consider it 6 books, or you can consider it one novel, which is what I consider it. But it was never 3. It was divided to 3 by his publisher just for convenience sake and to fit the publication standards of the time. And yet by doing so, that set the pattern for all these other books to follow.
Well, you also just run into the physical aspect of there's a size of a book that you can make. And after it gets to be a certain size, it just gets difficult to physically make it.
That is true.
We see that a lot on the paperbacks.
And I'm pushing the edge of it with Storm of Swords was 1,500 pages in manuscript. That's very long. It's substantially longer than either of the first 2 books of the series. So as a result, when Storm of Swords is released in paperback a year and a half from now, it will be divided into 2.
Yeah.
So it'll be the Storm of Swords Part 1 and Part 2, because it's simply not publishable as a paperback. The paperback would self-destruct as you read it. Pages would fall out, the spine would break. There's limitations to what you can do with paper and glue.
Mm-hmm. Fewer limitations on hardback, but
I've
seen a lot of books lately do that, come out in a Part 1 and Part 2 for the paperback release.
I mean, the other part of the question you asked is why are these books so big, is I think that besides the Tolkien thing, you need space to create a world, and creating a world is essential. In all of these high fantasy series, not only my own, the world is a character, and perhaps one of the most important characters. When people speak of Tolkien, they speak of Middle-earth. When they speak of Stephen Donaldson, they speak of the land. Gormenghast, of course, in Gormenghast, in that case, the castle becomes the entire world. But you need landscape. You need history. You need a sense that this is not simply a setting for a story, but this is a living place in and of its own. And fantasy fans love that. Fantasy fans respond very strongly to that. And, of course, you need room to do all of that. So that's one of the things that makes these books so large.
When you're writing a very long and involved story, how do you keep everything straight in your head? I mean, well, do you sit down and...
All the interviewers keep asking me that question. I don't know the answer to it, except it's there in my head. I can remember that, Maybe it's a writer's trick memory. I forget real people. If I meet you on the street a week from now, I probably won't know who you are. But I remember my characters.
Well, I was wondering if you sit down and do a detailed outline and plan for each book, for the whole series?
No.
Or do you just let it kind of grow in your head?
I do not. I have some notes. I have a rough idea of where the series is going. I know kind of the ultimate fate of most of the major characters and how the thing is going to end, but I don't know every twist and turn of the road that's going to take me there. I discover that in the writing, and I think that's what gives the writing immediacy and interest, and I think I'd be very bored if I outlined everything very thoroughly and knew everything I was going to write. Then it would just sort of be filling in the blanks when I actually sat down to do it, and it would be kind of a boring and onerous task that I would quickly lose interest in. Because deciding those things is the most fun part of writing, the most imaginative part.
That act of creation is what fuels your interest in doing the project.
Yes,
and if you spend that energy on the outline, you don't have it for the thing the reader's going to see.
Then all you got is casting it into words. Now, casting into words is very important. I mean, the language of a book is crucial, but it's also very hard. It's not as much fun as deciding what's going to happen, but getting the right words. I mean, knowing what's going to happen in the scene, and you're writing that scene, but you can't get it across. The sentences aren't working. You're taking them apart and putting them together. You're taking in an adjective here and putting in an adverb there and trying to get stronger verbs. I mean, that's difficult. When it's working best is you're just flowing and you're living the scene. You're almost as if you're there. You're one of the characters. You're seeing it unfold before you and you're describing it. I mean, on a good day, I sit down in the morning and I fall through the computer screen into the Seven Kingdoms, and then I look up and it's dark outside and the day is gone and I've got however many pages I have, but those are the best days. They don't come very often, but that's the kind of day you hope for.
When it's happening, it's like you're watching a movie in your head and you're trying to write down what's happening.
Yes, kind of, yeah, definitely.
Now, when the characters come alive like that, you kind of know where the story is headed, but then the characters come alive.
And yes, they do take the story in different directions. Some of the characters do that. They're perverse little creatures, and they will throw you a curveball.
Can you give us an example of where one of the characters stole the story and drove it in their own direction?
Okay, well, in the first book, in A Game of Thrones, there was a crucial point where an assassin tries to kill Bran in his bed, and he's defeated, and they get this dagger, and it's a very unusual dagger. The Stark family by then has split, because Ned Stark has gone south with the king, and he's taken with him his two daughters, while Catelyn Stark, his wife, is still at Winterfell with her sons Robb and Bran and Rickon, and many of the family retainers. There's a scene where they meet, and my intention was that Catelyn would send a messenger with the dagger to Ned Stark in King's Landing to try to unravel this difficulty. But as I sat down and wrote this scene, Catelyn wouldn't do it. She wouldn't send a letter. She was going to go herself. Someone had tried to kill her child, and it was the dagger, and she wasn't going to. Yes, I'll write a very strong letter and send it off, and I'll pick this minor character as a messenger. No, that was something that she was going to do herself. And that threw me for a bit of a loop because, again, in my original thought, she was remaining at Winterfell, kind of as the ruler of the North. But some part of me knew the character better than the part that had done that initial plotting. I don't really believe in this mystical stuff you hear some author talk about, where we use it as a shorthand. The character's talking to us, the character's saying things. It's really one part of your mind talking to another part of your mind. It's all coming from the author, but maybe it's a right brain, left brain kind of thing. But whatever is the creative part of the brain is not necessarily the analytical part, and it knows better sometimes. And the analytical part may devise plots, but the creative part is the one that gives the heart and soul to the characters, and it overrules the analytical part sometimes.
That conflict within the mind, that listening to other people in your head. I mean, you played off of that very well in a story ages ago, which my mind is now forgetting the title. The story of the person on a gateway, the guardian of the gateway. Science fiction.
Analog cover story?
Yeah.
That was one of my very earliest stories.
The title was again?
The Second Kind of Loneliness.
Yes. I totally forgot the title. But there you had a character who is playing off against the voices in his head, and dealing with that being on the edge of insanity. As a writer, does it make you nervous listening to people talk in your head?
No, it makes me nervous, the idea that it may stop. I mean, it's interesting to see how writers go to hell. Of course, you always hope it won't happen to you, that you'll just get better and better until the day you die at 137. But, of course, it happens to most writers. Not all of them. There are writers like Jack Vance, who's one of my favorite writers, who I think is writing just as good as he ever was, and his stuff is terrific, and I buy every Vance novel and read it the minute it comes out. But
they've just reprinted his Dying Earth series.
Yes, wonderful.
Which is, if people
wonderful,
haven't read it,
seminal fantasy series. The Dying Earth deserves to be mentioned, along with Middle Earth and Howard's Hyborian Age, as one of the great settings of fantasy. Published in a very small edition in the early 50s by an obscure minor house called Hillman, and yet its effect on later fantasy is incalculable. But putting Vance aside as an exception, I do think many authors go to hell later in their lives, and the ones who are very analytical, rational things go to hell. Their books become lifeless. You get the sense as you read each book that it's just like the book that came before, and that they're rewriting the same story over and over again. They're just going through the paces, you know. They've read too many stories about outlines of how to write a novel, and now they're doing it. On the other hand, the writers who have depended more on the creative part, perhaps who haven't been quite so analytical, what tends to happen to some of them is they just fall silent. Suddenly, someone who's been a very prolific writer stops writing, and you don't see any new books from them. I mean, you look at a writer like Theodore Sturgeon, tremendously prolific early in his career, and then suddenly he's taking 20 years to write his last novel, and it's still not complete when he dies. Or Walter M. Miller, you know, how many decades did he work on the sequel to Canticle for Leibowitz, and finally it had to be completed by another writer after his death.
After he had committed suicide.
Yes. And from all reports that I've heard, there really wasn't much more to be done. There was only a little bit more to be done, and yet somehow he found himself unable to do it. So the fear is not of the voices in your head. The fear is that someday the voices will go silent. By then, you better hope you have a lot of good stocks and bonds.
When you're starting a story, do you think of characters and situations? Do you think of a situation and find the characters to fit the situation? Do you come up with an image of something? Do you pose a question in your
By
mind?
the time I sit down, I know. I mean, the ideas come to you. They don't come to you sitting in front of the computer. They come to you.
Where do they come to you?
In all times, you know, when you're lying in bed just before you go to sleep, and when you're riding on a train or in an airplane, or when you're driving in traffic. Usually it's a time when you're alone in some sense. You may be surrounded by people, but you're alone. You're not engaged in conversation. And the ideas come to you. So hopefully you write them down. Sometimes you forget them if you don't write them down. And then when the moment comes to work on them, you kind of take out your idea book or your notes and say, yeah, this one, I'll see what I can do with this one.
Now, in the Song of Ice and Fire series, you've been ending each book more or less on a cliffhanger. Is it?
I have not. I deny this. This is the same thing an earlier interviewer just said to me this afternoon. I have like eight or nine viewpoint characters. Mm-hmm. So at each time I end a book, I have to end a book for each of them. I have to decide where I'm going to leave each of these characters, which is always difficult because these characters are all scattered over 2 continents and having various sorts of adventures. Each book, I think, has some sense of closure. Each book marks the end of a particular phase of the story or chapter of the story, as you could call it. So, in essence, I have to come up with 8 or 9 appropriate endings, ways to go out, and I try to vary those. Some of the characters do go out with, you know,
with a bang.
Well, some characters go out with death, yes. Some characters go out with some major change in their life. They've reached a decision. Something has happened to them. They've left something behind and started some new aspect of their life or career. And that's what I strive for with the majority of the endings. But it's true in each book, usually 1 character, sometimes 2, will be ended on something that one could consider a cliffhanger. But usually only one out of 8. I think the reason for a cliffhanger is you want the reader to wonder what's going to happen next. You want the reader to want to come back for the next volume.
Yeah.
And a cliffhanger has always served that function.
In a book with multiple viewpoint characters, 8, 9 viewpoint characters, and you've got all these story threads that are weaving in and out. Sometimes two threads will weave around each other and then separate, and you've got this tapestry that you're weaving. Do you sit down and write all 8, 9 viewpoint characters simultaneously, or do you pick one and kind of follow that one through and then figure out where you're going to divide and mix everything together?
I start off trying to write the chapters in the order in which they're going to be read, but it is true I don't often stick with that for very long. I usually get into a groove on a particular character, Tyrion or Arya, whoever it may be, Jon Snow, and suddenly I start writing exclusively from a viewpoint of that character. I'll finish a Tyrion chapter, and the next chapter is supposed to be Bran or someone, but instead I'll skip ahead and do the next Tyrion chapter, and maybe skip ahead and do the next Tyrion chapter after that.
Well, I've got to tell you, as a reader, when I'm really into a story and I'm really into what's happening to a character, I am known to flip ahead to read the next chapter for that character.
Well, you shouldn't do that. It's okay for me. It's not good for you.
Well, I do it anyway.
You're a reader. You're supposed to read them in the order I give them to you.
I'm a bad reader. If your characters can change the direction of the story, I can change the direction of the read.
Because things happen in between in the chapters of other characters that impact on, so you may find out things that you didn't want to know.
That's happened.
Yeah.
But sometimes you just can't help yourself.
Also, of course, I find myself constantly rearranging the order of chapters. I mean, I start out with a kind of rough outline of, how the chapters will fall. You want to try to come back to every character kind of semi-regularly, because otherwise the reader's likely to forget that they exist. But I discovered very early on in the process that you couldn't do it rigidly.
Yeah.
I started out in the first book. Initially, I had a structure. I had like 7 characters initially, and I was going to, every 7th chapter, and then it would always be the same order. Each character would have a chapter 7 chapters apart. It didn't work at all, because sometimes one character is right in the midst of all the events and lots of things are happening to him, and another character is in a quiet portion of the story and not much is happening. And sometimes the chapters only cover a day, and sometimes they cover 6 months. So, you really have to look at them hard, and you have to vary the kind of approaches you take to them. I'm always juggling the chronology. Should I present the chapters in chronological order? Or the other question is for dramatic effect. I mean, sometimes cutting back and forth in certain ways, you get some interesting points and counterpoints. There's internal cliffhangers as well as the cliffhangers at the end of the books. Yeah. I frequently try to end a chapter on a cliffhanger or a chapter on a new development or a plot twist. Then you want some other chapters in between, so there is...
Sometimes you can use the chapters in between just to let the reader have a breather.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that happens too.
You want to avoid the second Indiana Jones phenomenon, where there were so many things piled on top of each other that after a while it's just like, poof,
right.
I don't care.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
I enjoy when you've got a book like these where you've got a lot of characters, a lot of scope, and characters can go sometimes for a book without interacting. And then as the books move on toward a conclusion, certain characters suddenly start getting closer and closer to interacting, and it's...
Well, for the most part, all the characters were together when the first book began and have gone their separate ways. I said most, not all. There was always Daenerys, who was always off on a different continent, and they're spreading further and further apart, but of course, toward the end, some of them will be coming together again, too.
Now, aren't you introducing some new characters in the next book?
Well, I introduce new characters in every book. I'm not certain I'm going to introduce any new point-of-view characters. I'm considering that question, and I haven't really arrived at an answer. I do need to make this next book somewhat shorter than A Storm of Swords, which, as I say, was just at the edge point of being too long to publish in a single volume. In fact, there was some discussion with my publisher about cutting that book into 2, even in hardcover, and making it into 2 volumes, but I'd prefer that not be done. One way to get a slightly shorter book is by resisting my urge to add a bunch of new viewpoint characters.
Now, do you find that adding a new viewpoint character makes it more enjoyable for you because it livens up the writing by having some new friend?
Yeah, there's an element to that. It opens a new aspect to the thing. A viewpoint character gives you not only a new friend, but it gives you an entirely new way of looking, an entire new pair of eyes to look at your old friends. because the new viewpoint character has different knowledge and may have a different slant on many events that have gone before. So suddenly the reader, who has been told that a character is like this or something happened a particular way, here's a very different way of looking at things and has to step back and say, whoa, and maybe make a reappraisal, and think about it, which I like my readers to do, and my readers are great at doing this. I have some of the best and smartest readers. Some of the websites that are set up and devoted to Ice and Fire, they keep amazing news groups and bulletin boards and things like that going, and they write me with questions that they've argued about and some pretty interesting discussions that they have there. They're very sharp, and they do think about it a lot, and I like that because you want a readership who notices the subtleties that you're sweating to put into the book, and this is one way of getting it. I'm a big believer in viewpoints. Too many of us, as we read these books, believe everything that we're told by the author, and we shouldn't. We should.
Authors lie.
Well, authors lie and the characters lie, and to the extent that you're inside a character's head, you have to realize that you're getting his point of view of what's going on. And the author should never lie in anything that's factual, where he's describing the world, saying the sun is coming up. Well, you don't say the sun is coming up if the sun is not coming up, but it's a pretty day. That's the character giving an opinion on it,
Mm-hmm.
And it might not be such a pretty day to a different character.
The Ice and Fire series has inspired incredible amounts of commentary in all manner of places.
Yes, it's great.
What is it about this series of yours that has inspired so much more discussion than other books that you've done?
Well, compared with my other series, I think that the biggest difference is that it's an ongoing, open-ended series. Most of my previous novels have been single, standalone novels. So the reader reads them in one sitting or several sittings close together, and then they're over. When a work of art is complete, there's not much to discuss. You know where it's going. You can't have arguments or discussions about this is where I think it's going, or this is the kind of plot development that I want to see, because, you've read it. You know what's going to happen. It's already happened. A series that is still in the process of going on, I think, allows the readers to participate a lot more in having that kind of discussion. The only phenomenon that I've seen anything like what we're getting on A Song of Ice and Fire previously that I was connected with was the Wildcard books, which were also an open-ended series. That was on a much smaller scale, of course, since those books did not have the huge audience that the Ice and Fire books are getting, but still many Wildcard fans, and it was quite a popular series for a time, would have the same kinds of vigorous discussions about who their favorite characters were and who were good guys and who were bad guys and what should happen next and what they didn't want to happen next, etc. And we'd see that at conventions when we would do Wildcard panels at conventions.
Does the feedback from the readership while you're in the middle of an ongoing series, does that ever influence what you do with the series, the direction of it? Somebody writes...
No, it doesn't. I try not to let it anyway. I don't actually read the bulletin boards, precisely because I know if I did read the bulletin boards, it might have an influence. It might have an influence both ways. What I read on the bulletin boards might influence the books, and my presence would inevitably influence the bulletin boards. Instead of the readers arguing with each other, it would all become sort of question for Mr. Martin sort of thing, where they were looking to me to answer questions or resolve things. I'd rather have them discuss it with each other than just make it a sort of a internet question and answer. But I do get emails, of course, from the fans. So even without going into the bulletin boards, I hear some of what's going on from these emails. I do try not to let myself be influenced by that, because I think you get in trouble if you do. Like you set out with a book. For example, I'll give an example from the Ice and Fire series. The incident I mentioned already when we were talking about Catelyn, where an assassin is sent to kill Bran. And it's a mystery for most of the first two books. Who sent this assassin? And I know the fans had many, many discussions about this. And the answer to that is revealed in the third book. I solved that particular mystery as part of the closure of that book. But for the first two books, it was unresolved. So the readers were free to suspect this one or suspect that one and to make their arguments about who they thought did it. Now, inevitably, there are only to be generous, to be extremely generous about a dozen likely suspects for this. Maybe only a half dozen who are at all logical and another half dozen who would be like extreme long shots. So when you have several hundred people discussing and arguing, inevitably some of them are going to hit on the right answer and maybe convince the others. And, then you have a situation where everybody knows the right answer, or at least you could get that impression if you were up on the board. So what do you do then as the author? Do you change the answer? Because, gosh, they've all figured it out. Well, that's not going to be very good, Well, you don't. You can't. If you're influenced by that, you're going to get very unsatisfying things, because you've already laid the groundwork for the first answer, and it was that groundwork that led whoever figured it out to figure it out. And now if you start changing that, you're changing the rules of the game in the middle, and you're also providing, I think, an unsatisfying artistic experience. Yeah. I've always thought, I've never met George Lucas. I've never had a chance to actually sit down and talk with him about any of that. But I've always wondered whether Lucas wasn't affected by his audience to some extent. Because I think if you look at Star Wars, there are clearly things being set up by that suddenly changed abruptly in the later movies. I don't believe that he set out knowing that Luke and Leia were brother and sister. I think if you look at the first movie, they were clearly meant to be a love interest with each other. But the audience responded much more strongly to Han than to Luke. That was part of it. And I don't think that Darth Vader was even originally Luke's father. Obi-Wan clearly says in the first movie, he killed your father. It doesn't seem to me it admits to any really double meaning. I think, again, it was a case where Lucas, in between films, changed his mind, perhaps in response to the audience, and started deepening things.
I think for a book or film or any artistic endeavor like that to be satisfying, it's got to have a single author, a single vision. And as soon as the audience is guiding and directing what happens, you've lost the single artistic guidance.
Right.
And you end up with, dear God, television, which is surprising that it's as good as it is, as often as it is, considering what you have to do it. You spent some years, in fact, writing in television.
Yes, I did.
How did writing for television influence you as a writer of books?
Well, I think it had some direct influences and some indirect influences. The screenplays are an easier form than a novel.
Why is that?
Because they're less complete. They're a blueprint for a work rather than a work itself. And you can rely on other people to fill in a lot of the other necessary. The actor will bring something to the party. The director will bring something to the party. The special effects technicians, the makeup men, the set dressers, all of that will bring something to the party that will make it a rounded artistic whole. But screenplays do need to have two things, and I think William Goldman wrote about this in Adventures in the Screenplay. They need a very strong structure, and, of course, the dialogue has to be very good. And I think working in Hollywood for 10 years on television and film helped me in both those regards. I think structurally my stories are better now, and I think the dialogue is sharper than it was before I started on that. And that's the direct influence. The indirect influence is that kind of reacting against television. In television film, one thing is that you have to be very concise. You have very tight limits on how long the work can be. An hour teleplay has 46 minutes, and it has to be told in 46 minutes. So,
with suitable interruptions for commercials.
That's why 46 is less than, 60 minutes is the hour.
But it's got to be broken up into pieces that fit around the commercials.
That's right. Act breaks.
And they're very rigorous.
My scripts were always initially too long. I would turn in a script that was too long, and then I would, in the process of rewriting, was always a process of cutting for me, of cutting a line here, a word there. I called it sweating a script. I would sometimes remove an entire subplot or an entire character or something like that, but mostly I would get my scripts down to size just by sweating them, line by line, word by word, getting it down to the right length so it would fit. And movies are the same, 120 pages.
Absolute upper limit, unless you're...
unless you're established, but that's certainly what they look for. So by the time I'd been doing that for 10 years, I was sick of it, frankly, and I wanted to do something that gave me a little room. I thought, in many cases, when I look back on it, I thought the earlier drafts of the scripts before I had sweated them were richer. The descriptions were better. They certainly were better reads. Some of them were more layered. There was a little room for more subtlety, for more complexity, both in the plot and in the characterization. And you had to lose that. You had to meet the deadline. So I came out of that television experience very much wanting to do something big, something complex, something that was large and epic and grand in scale, where I didn't have to worry about an extra phrase that maybe did not advance the plot. And the result, of course, is A Song of Ice and Fire, which is as epic a scale as you could possibly hope for. Yes.
George, I'm just watching as time rapidly spins away. It just seems to always do that. Another question about television. The shows you were known for working on, Twilight Zone, Beauty and the Beast, both clearly fantasy shows. Why is it, though, that there is so little fantasy done on television? You can point to any number of cop shows, westerns, science fiction, but the fantasy genre
television is very imitative, and it's always afraid to try something new, and then when something succeeds, everybody wants to try it. Also, there's great resistance on television to doing anything that's not set in the here and now. There's a lot of resistance to historical settings, to things set in other cultures and other worlds and all that. So I think that all of that is part of it. The writers would gladly write fantasy shows if the networks would put them on the air, but I don't see any evidence for that happening. Now, I think, and a lot of this also derives from films. We haven't really talked about films, but there's never been a really successful fantasy movie. I mean, Lucas broke through for science fiction in a huge way with Star Wars, and science fiction has never looked back in either feature films or in television. There's been a lot of things since Star Wars that kind of opened the floodgates. But then a few years later, Willow was made, and I think a lot of people expected Willow, another Lucasfilm, to do the same thing for fantasy, for it to be, up there with Star Wars and E.T., one of the top-grossing films of all time, and it didn't do that. None of the big fantasy films have ever moved in those things. You had Dragonheart a few years ago, Labyrinth, Legend, Dragon Slayer, been a number of efforts to do fantasy films. The original animated versions of Lord of the Rings, all of them have either been out-and-out flops or, at best, kind of mediocre successes that don't inspire imitation. But I think there's the potential now that that's going to change. And you think the new Lord of the Rings, the 3 films shot at once, what I've seen of it on the Internet has been extremely promising. And I know there's a buzz on that already among fantasy fans and Tolkien readers. Those films, if they are good, if they deliver on the promise, have the potential to be, I think, as big as the Star Wars films, as big as the Indiana Jones films, to set records. And once that happens, all the studios and all the networks will be trampling over each other to make a lot of other fantasy films.
Oh, God. That means we will get decades of bad fantasy films. Oh, God.
Be careful what you wish for.
Don't you know. George, a couple of questions before we kind of slide off.
Sure.
A Storm of Swords, it's the middle book of a 6-book set. How have you dealt with anticipating readers who may have not read the first 2 books?
Well, they should go read the first 2 books. I don't put in what has gone before. Number one, I find those tremendously hard to write and tremendously hard to read. They're usually boring, turgid kinds of things. And also, I think they're a disservice to the story that has gone before, because the story is more than its plot summary. I mean, a plot summary has a place, but if a plot summary was all there was, then why bother write the story in the first place?
Well, doesn't that get back to your problem with outlining?
Yes, it does. It's the same thing. So I don't do that. In each book, I try to write the opening chapters in such a way to remind the readers of what has gone before. The readers who have read it, at least. I think they're owed a reminder, because it may be a couple of years since they read the last book. That way they're reminded of what went before. But I won't do an out-and-out summary.
You're in the middle of a 6-book series now. The Song of Ice and Fire. Storm of Swords is out. As you sit at this point in the middle of the series, How has the direction changed from what you had anticipated when you started? You've changed as a writer. The world is constantly changing.
The characters change it in certain ways, but I don't think the main direction has changed. I still have the vision in mind that I started with, and I'm still working from that vision.
Cool series. Cool series. You're a very good writer.
Thank you again.
God, I'm not going to get away without one more question. You first started out writing science fiction, then you have kind of gotten known for writing fantasy. Your TV stuff was fantasy. What's the dividing line between science fiction and fantasy?
There's also horror. Don't forget that you
and then horror.
Writing horror in there.
Yeah, so you've got horror, but right now we're just focused on fantasy. What's the dividing line between science fiction and fantasy?
I have an entire hour speech on that subject that I have given at a couple conventions, but I don't happen to have it with me to explore it. I don't think there is a significant difference, to tell you the truth. I mean, I've read the other opinions on the subject from some very thoughtful people like Brian Aldiss, and Troy Esprit talks about the dreaming pole and the thinking pole, etc. But I think they're both flavors more than they are fundamentally different. When I was a kid, I would read Robert A. Heinlein one week and J.R. Tolkien the next week and H.P. Lovecraft the week after that. And I never drew sharp lines between them saying, "Ooh, I'm reading science fiction, now I'm reading fantasy." I was just reading, I don't know, imaginative literature. My father called it weird stuff. He would, "Why do you like all that weird stuff?"
That was probably a kinder term than many of us heard.
He liked westerns himself.
I like to call it the fantastique.
Oh, okay. I'll stick with weird stuff. So I like weird stuff, both as a reader and a writer. And the particular flavor of weird stuff, whether it has an alien in it or a dragon in it, that doesn't matter. They're all weird stuff. These are symbols that we're dealing with. These are archetypes. You know, there are no aliens. There are no dragons. We use the images to enrich the books.
One last question. In all the things that you do, the writing and all the other stuff, what is it in that gives you the most joy?
Gosh, the act of having written.
Many people would agree with you.
Yes.
George, thanks for joining us tonight. It's been a lot of fun.
You're welcome. Yes, always glad to be here.